Welcome to another episode of the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. In this episode, Mike and I will be talking through Genesis 14. So we will, I think, get through the whole chapter, Mike. It looks like we have it in front of us here, and I kind of know where I want to go with our thoughts. But I'd like to begin with where I kind of warned you I'd go with last time, and that is an opening question that comes out of chapter 12. Actually, it comes out of 11 and 12. And it will specifically come out of 14, and it will be repeated throughout the rest of the Bible. So I want to kind of open it up here, and that is this concept of, in a secular sense, maybe even, or maybe just a religious sense, the idea of a divine portal. Have you ever thought about that? Or if I said that to you, do you believe in divine portals? What would you say back?
Well, I guess my first question would be to ask, how would you define a portal? Because
and that's fair.
Yeah.
By divine portal, I mean, and okay, I'm being fair to your question, and I'm thinking of this as we talk. So let me clarify as you ask. A divine portal, in my definition, would be a place that is perceived by a human or even a tribe of people where a God would commune as a place on earth, that this God or gods would use a specific place on earth to come into our world and somehow commune with us there. If you've ever seen, my favorite angel movie is the Mothman Prophecies. And it was back, I don't know, 2000. And it's about a true story of a town in West Virginia. And I'm not going to give it away. I would recommend the movie to you. It's my favorite Richard Gere movie of all time. And that's saying a lot, by the way. And he plays the role of a reporter. And it's a true story. He goes to this little town in West Virginia where there's sightings. Okay. And then you can look up Mothman in Google and get the background. But the story is that this little town and its environs had been visited over time, and especially at this one point in time, by a divine being. So that's my definition.
Okay. Well, I think if we're talking about within the scriptures, I can see, it doesn't use the word portal, but it,
right.
It does seem to be there are places that are seen as almost as though it's easier to commune with spiritual beings, including Yahweh, right? And the first one that immediately comes in my mind is Eden. We have in chapter 3 this interesting statement of how God has, based on habit, walking around in the garden. He's walking in a physical place. He's in the place where Adam and his wife are at, and yet,
right.
There seems to be this kind of very easy, almost porous nature to Eden, that divine and human are interacting. And
yeah. And then Ezekiel 14, or is it Ezekiel 28, gives that sense of walking back. You were walking back and forth, and Revelation 22, which recasts the Eden story. You certainly have a presence of God there. Let's get into our text then by showing you why I brought this up. In Genesis 12, and I mentioned 11 because of the Babel story, that ziggurat idea of building a flat-topped pyramid upon the top of which, is that right? Yeah. The top of which you would use to commune with the heavenly realm. And then you'd even have a stairway, that's not for humans, that's for the gods, to come back down to their temple. And the temple would be on the ground. And like in Babylon, the temple's on the ground, but this ziggurat is next to the temple that gives the food at the top of the pyramid a place where a deity can come and commune with you and then come down the steps into his own home or temple. So that's their idea of a portal, as it were. But then in 12:8, you have the beginning of a story that revolves around Bethel. He moved from there to the mountain. This is Abraham east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. You can stand on that spot today. It's a small little village in Samaria, but you can find that location. I did in 2017. It was a fun day to finally get there and read this story standing on that plot. And notice again in the text, he called upon the name of Yahweh, and that seems to be important. And then 13:4, he went to the place of the altar which he had made there at first, and there Abram called on the name of Yahweh. Then you head up to 28:11, which starts the story. We'll get there, of course, the famous story of the ladder vision. He came to a certain place. We find out in verse 9. Now I'm in Genesis 28:11. He came to a certain place. We find out in verse 19, it's Bethel, and stayed there all night because the sun had set. Put stones down. He dreamed. Verse 12. A ladder was set up on the earth. Its top reached to heaven. And there the angels, well, again, read it in Hebrew, the Malachim, messengers. That word angel is made up. It's Englishized, an Anglicized word. The messengers of Elohim were ascending and descending on it. 15, behold, I am with you and I will keep you wherever you go. Then when you get to 17, that's the key verse here. He was afraid and he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of El, and this is the gate of heaven. Now, here's my question again, and then, by the way, go up to 35:7, where that idea of returning to a spot where you were before comes up again. 35:7, this is Jacob, 35:6. So Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all his people who were with him, and there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, El, the house of God. Because there, and now that word in your Bibles probably has a capital G on it, but the verb is plural. Because there Elohim appeared to him, plural gods appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brother. And that's, again, I think, recasting the story of the Malachim, the messengers of Elohim coming back and forth. So the point is that you have, and that's just a quick rendition of the Bethel story. And when we get to 14 today, Genesis 14, we're going to have, at our halfway point of the podcast, we're going to come to verse 18 and meet a man named Melchizedek who is living in Salem, turns out to be Jerusalem. And a strange thing of all strange things, he's worshiping the same God that Abraham is when they meet. And so the question has often been, and this is just Jewish tradition now too, that the place that God will someday choose to place his name, oddly enough, will be the same place that Abraham meets this strange priest king named Melchizedek. And then, and let's do it as we go again through our studies to come, the idea that Jerusalem becomes also and maybe I can use this actually as my answer to my own question that I posed to you. Do you believe in portals? I do believe that God has used the earth in some very specific ways to commune with man. So whether it be the story of Melchizedek that's going to be in front of us here, that there was something special about that spot on the earth that the writer and the reader were probably in agreement on at the time of the writing and editing of Genesis. They believed that this place was sacred space, that it was somehow a place that God himself, our God, the creator God, Yahweh, would commune with mankind in a special way, okay? That probably started with a Bethel idea, the house of El. That's why it's called that. And I think that's plural, Elohim, or it can be in the sense of this is where gods, plural, appeared to Jacob. So in my mind's eye, and again, I'll give you my view, Mike, on my question, and then you can respond. I think the portal idea is one of those biblical concepts that needs to be respected where it shows up. Okay, so that Bethel was in their minds, in the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a special place on earth that God chose to commune with man. He could have done it anywhere, but he chose that spot on earth. Jerusalem will become a spot like that. And Bethel may have retained it because notice again, and I'm going to review my story in front of you. When the 10 tribes of the north split from David, they put altars in Bethel.
And Dan.
And I think they chose that spot for a reason. Not just geographically, but I think they respected the idea that this is a divine portal in their tradition. And they wanted people to come to Bethel as a rejection of Yahweh, frankly. And that's why you get in one of the minor prophets, go to Bethel and sin, which is one of our favorite, lines to bring up against people who go to Bethel College here in St. Paul. But the point being that Bethel becomes not the house of Yahweh, it becomes the house of divine beings that are in competition with Yahweh. See that point there? Then, again, I'm just going to give you my whole story, and I'd love you to respond. That you get to Jesus, and Jesus is so important to the biblical story, of course, for many reasons. One of the reasons is to clarify this idea of a divine portal. He comes to a people, I think, who are looking for someone to come from Jerusalem to be the Messiah, right? That's where he would be born. And so the idea of, in their minds, if we're going to get our Messiah in our lifetime, we're going to look to our royal city to get him. And the fact that he comes from Nazareth, which is a very Gentile town, a Roman town, in fact, is one of those off-putting ideas about Jesus that he has to work through most of his career. He says to the woman in Samaria in John 4 that it's neither on this mountain nor on the other that you need to worship. And remember that conversation about where we worship will not matter to our God and to Yahweh. So I think what Jesus was doing there is dispelling a tradition that had become entrenched in the Jewish tradition, and that is where you worship is important. And Jesus is trying to say it doesn't matter. Then you get to Paul, and the whole point of Paul, not the whole point, a major theme in Paul's ministry to Gentiles is that they do not need to go back to Jerusalem to worship. So that he'll go into a city, name your favorite Pauline epistle, Ephesians, he'll never give them the sense that they need to go back to Jerusalem. And the reason for Paul is that I think he understood the tenets of what Jesus had been teaching, and that is that this divine portal idea has now been allowed to obsolesce, and that God himself has wished that people wouldn't think in those terms. Notice I'm not saying it's gone. I'm just saying that the idea is not necessary. So that, and here's one of my favorite verses to prove that or demonstrate it, would be Romans 12, when he says to people living in Rome, 1,000 miles from Jerusalem, your logical or reasonable worship pattern is how you'd translate the end of Romans 12:2. This is your reasonable service, or however it comes out in King James.
Or act of worship.
The way to do that is to give your body a living sacrifice. In other words, turn that whole concept of sacrifice on its ear. Give yourself a living sacrifice. It just reeks of not doing everything the Levitical law demanded. Kill an animal? No, give yourself living, whatever. And Paul's shock value there is that you in Rome can serve the God of creation and never go to Jerusalem. So, long story short, I throw that open to you because as a conversation piece for a divine counsel worldview, I think it's important to introduce to the idea to our listeners that as we approach Genesis 14 and this whole story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they will, and we'll talk about it when we get to specifically to Melchizedek, they were under the impression, and I think rightfully so, maybe it comes from the Eden tradition, I don't know, that when God wants to commune with mankind, he will often choose a location on earth to do it. And that we should read, therefore, when we read the story, we should read the story with that in tow and be fair to the story because that's where they were.
What
do you think?
I think it's this is one of those moments where we realize, like, especially as like 21st century Westerners, right? Like we have been so inundated or so familiar with the concept that the Creator God is everywhere, anywhere. He can hear all things, like that. He doesn't need us to be at a specific location to pray, right? Like we don't have to be at a special place to talk with him. But this is, flying right in our face of this realization that Abram at this point probably still thinking a lot of still very cultured pagan practices of, well, there are obviously places where the gods and humanity can interact, and it's a lot easier for us, and it's maybe more porous of a location. And it just makes sense to him. And I think there is something about God is accommodating to that. And I do think it's kind of funny that God does not, he doesn't use he doesn't use Babylon, he doesn't use any of the major places where all these other deities had set themselves up as like, I'm going to talk with you here. Instead, he just chooses a spot almost as though this is random. Like here, now I'm going to call this Bethel. And it's only because of what happened at Bethel with Abram that spot then becomes important over these centuries. The sad thing, and I love how you pointed it out, that the trajectory over time was that Bethel, and I think even Dan, like when the nation split into two, Bethel and Dan became the places of worship. So places that used to be worship for Yahweh were in some sense then co-opted or perverted to then the worship of Baal and Asherah and other Canaanite deities. Like just that God is not necessarily like, oh no, I'm so tied to this one spot. But it's like, okay, well, the people have.
Well, with the understanding that this is where, if you're going to commune with the deity, here's a spot to do it. That's where I'm going with it too. That he didn't start up. Jeroboam didn't put high places in out of the way odd spots. I think he chose the place that he knew the tradition was that Yahweh communed with David, and he co-opted it. That's the thing. That's what made it so dastardly. When I read that story, is he's undoing the very thing that David's world had understood, and that is that this is a spot that God. Now, and I like what you said early on to my question, that God accommodated something, and it's going to take some very forward-thinking theologians in the Bible to realize that God doesn't have to do this, and I think David's one of them. On the hills of Bethlehem as a shepherd, I feel in the Psalms that he is communing with Yahweh. He's talking to him, not out of a divine portal, but just sitting on a hill. And I can take that as a modern believer and appreciate what David knew, and use David thus as a very forward-thinking theologian. And even his son Solomon, I'm sure, learned this, because when you get to 1 Kings 8 and the dedicatory prayer of the temple, which is that permanent house of Yahweh now, even Solomon, who becomes quite polygamous or quite polytheistic in some sense in his worship patterns, at least he in 1 Kings is 8:63, he mentions how Yahweh cannot live in a home. He's bigger than that. He's beyond living in a spot on earth. So he probably knew in his head that Yahweh was not to be approached just through a portal. But again, it's funny how, as you use again the word accommodation, I sense that our job as Bible readers is to get back into their worldview so thoroughly that when we hear of them talking about the gate of heaven / Bethel, we think like that. And we actually believe with them that God, visited people through this vision of a stairway. So that, and by the way, that stairway probably is a ziggurat, is, that ladder that we call it. It's just the word stairway. It doesn't have to be a ladder like our modern sense of putting it up against the side of our house.
And Ron, wouldn't it?
A lot going on there, but we'll get there in time.
Ron,
I'm ready for Genesis 14. If you are, so again, here's a lot of text that we don't need to read. If you have it open in front of you as a listener, in fact, this is one of those kind of, we read the Bible in a circle in our Sunday school class, and we always look at each other and laugh when they get to hard words, and we laugh with them, not at them, as they try to pronounce all these hard words. But chapter 14 is full of them. And so I'm just going to summarize. But notice the words that are picked up on. Verse 1, it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar. Now, Shinar is that land from which, again, Abraham will come. That's in the heart of Babylon. Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, title king of nations, or the Goyim. Sodom and Gomorrah mentioned in verse 2. And verse 5, notice the word Rephaim there, again translated as giants in some Bibles. Zuzim in Ham, and the Emim. So you get these words that are weird and hard to pronounce. What's interesting is if you go up to Deuteronomy, and I'm going to do it, Deuteronomy 2:11, hang on to the word Zuzim and Emim. When Joshua is moving and Moses is moving through the countries, the tribes on the other side of Jordan, coming into Canaan, in Deuteronomy 2:11, just listen to some of the words that are used. They are also regarded as Rephaim, like the Anakim, but the Moabites call them Emim. 2:20. That was also regarded as a land of Rephaim. Giants formerly dwelt there, but the Ammonites call them the Zazumim. Deuteronomy 3:11. For Og, king of Bashan, remained as a remnant of the Rephaim. Indeed, his bedstand was an iron bedstand. The idea that the Rephaim, Zuzim, and Emim, back in Genesis 14:5, are incidental words. That's what I'm trying to get out of our mind. These are kind of code words, at least code words for the Jewish people, the Israelites of that time period, the bad guys. These are the bad guys. These are the ones, again, this is cosmic warfare going on, or that we're going to get to, where the people involved worship other deities, and they are living in lands that are, again, think Genesis 11, where we've come. They are run by these other deities. They have been given by Yahweh to the authority of these other deities. So this is a witch god story, as I would say it. Down to verse 7, you see the word Amalekites, a strange group that again appear. Whenever the word Amalekite comes up in your Old Testament, stop and underline it and just ask yourself why. God has something against the Amalekites. That's my point. That when and this will come up later in our story of Genesis, and even as it Numbers and Deuteronomy, sometimes the word Amalekites will come up and the text will just stop and say, if you ever meet one, wipe them out. Remember, Saul doesn't kill all the Amalekites, and that's what gets God angry. There's just something about the Amalekites, and I'm not going to get into it here, but that, and I think it's a deity issue somehow, that there's a deity issue going on here where the Amalekites are just more wicked than others in some way. I'm not sure. The king of, notice verse 8, to us these two words do have the reek of evil, Sodom and Gomorrah, king of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the point is, if you're trying to think big picture, just get this. In 14:8 is one side of the battle, the king of Sodom, king of Gomorrah, king of Admah, against verse 9. So it's a verse 8 against verse 9 idea. Against Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, title king of the nations, the Goyim. Shinar is mentioned again there too. So it's 4 kings against 5. It's verse 8 against verse 9. They get into a fight. And again, for sake of the story, all we have to grab is verse 12. They took Lot. There's that guy that we met back in 13 who was watering his herd close to Sodom and Gomorrah. They took Lot, Abram's brother, turns out to be his brother's son, his nephew, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Now, again, if you're thinking in divine council worldview concepts, you're thinking which God is greater, which nation wins a war is always which God is stronger. So, poor Abraham, he is worshiping a minority deity that probably nobody knows about. He and his family, he doesn't have any kids yet, so it's just him and his wife and his servants that are worshiping this otherwise unnamed or unknown deity. We'll find out they call him el-elyon, God the High One. And his nephew gets taken off by these kings, these wicked kings that serve other deities. So far, if you're reading this the first time through, you're thinking, well, there goes Lot. There's no way to get him back because I'm sure our God's not strong enough to handle this. 13. Then one who escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, first use of that word, maybe coming from 1024, Eber, we're not sure. He dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre. We learned that at the end of 13. Now when Abraham heard, verse 14, that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants. He has a standing conscripted army, almost you could call it, of servants, people in his household. He's a wealthy man. And they went in pursuit as far as Dan. Now that's an update, of course, because Dan isn't named Dan until Laish is conquered in the book of Joshua. But again, this shows that a hand much later than Moses's has come in and updated the text for us, which we don't mind. He divided his forces, verse 15. He goes as far as Damascus, but here's the point, verse 16. And this again, from a cosmic worldview, would say, oh, so he brought back all the goods, brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. Guess who wins against the Goyim, the God of Abraham? At least you would get that much from reading it that way, that you have God, like at the end of 12, like in 13, you have the God of Abraham showing his power in an otherwise unexpected way, whether it be in, again, 12 would be Egypt, 13 would be in Canaan, and now 14 would be against these well-established kings, especially coming out of Shinar. 17 sets up the end of the chapter. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer. So Sodom wants to go out and say thank you, and the king of Sodom, and he will, but there is this this break in the story. It's only about 1, 2, 3 verses, so we'll deal with that now, and that's verse 18. Then, so this is Genesis 4:18. Then Melchizedek, and that word, that name, even right there, King of Peace, Malak, or Malek is king, and Tzedek is righteousness, or it could even come from the concept of peace from Shalem, the king of Salem. So we don't know, and I don't think it matters, the meaning of the name Melchizedek, but let's get into his story. Then Melchizedek, the first time he's ever mentioned, comes out of nowhere, king of Salem. Now Salem we know to be, this again first mentioned, Salem is the city that turns out to be later Jebus, that turns out to be later named by David, the city of David, and then Jerusalem. So Jerusalem in the future, and even today, this is the spot on the ground that is today, or in our story, known as Salem. It's on the side of a hill, not a large area. If you go to Israel today, you can walk across the entire city of Salem holding your breath. We often do that with our passengers. We say, our travelers, we say, okay, get a big breath, and we're going to walk across the city of Salem. And we do, and it's most of us can do it. So it's not very big at all. And so here, by the way, let me set up how I think this is looking in the text. Well, by the way, anything up to this point, I've been talking a lot. I hate to do that to you, Mike. Anything? There's not a lot to talk about in 14 so far. Well, but if you want to say anything, I'm glad to have you interrupt me.
Well, I was trying to say a little bit earlier before we started that, back to that, to the portal kind of question, I do think it's interesting that us as human beings, we do have a natural tendency. We seem to gravitate towards the idea of sacred spaces, sacred sites, right? That whatever religion that you may examine, there's always this phenomenon of finding special spots where there's this spiritual or like energy or whatever, however people describe it, but they are gravitating towards this idea of this is a special spot. And even as agnostic or as atheistic at times, the US may be, we still do and show something like that too when we build out certain special monuments, places of remembrance. I find it that, to continue on that accommodation kind of statement, it is just a natural pattern of human beings, I think, to want to create special spots where at least we can return to and think and dwell on about what had happened. But it is kind of comforting to see that God doesn't rebuke us. He doesn't, like shake a finger at us of like, you fools, but simply, I'm going to work with that. I'll work with you on that because I understand that is a natural tendency. Let me use that to my advantage. Back to this entire section, I do find it interesting and funny in some sense that, like you said, verse 8 and verse 9, you have these two major battles, these armies, these factions that are going at it. Sodom and Gomorrah's faction loses. And it's this one dude with 318 other guys following an unknown deity who basically wins the day and just outshows and outclasses all the other armies, like all of like both sides, that they're stronger than the army that beat Sodom and Gomorrah's faction. And then just certainly it's like, you don't want to mess with these guys. And so there is something very funny about how it's like, this was not even Abram's fight. He probably would have just, I don't want to get involved.
Yeah.
But because of Lot, he out of that need, we need to rescue my kinsman.
Yeah. It brings up to me, and a lot of people have talked about this, like in the Divine Council Facebook page and in that group and other places I've been. How do I explain a Divine Council worldview without sounding weird, to my Bible class or my pastor, whatever? And here's what I would recommend. It just comes to mind as you're talking, that what you can do when you're preaching through or teaching through places like Genesis 12, 13, and 14 is gently bring up the point that in the context of this text, the question of which deity is stronger is always, at least, within the text, if not undergirding all the ins and outs of what's going on. So the idea that, like in 12:17, but Yahweh plagued Pharaoh. All you have to say is to your class, our God showed his power in a land that was totally unexpected. And I don't think that would make people feel weird at all. They would realize that. Then 13, to this, I will give to you and your descendants forever this land that you're standing on. I don't think it would be weird or taken as weird in a classroom setting to say, the original reader would have been shocked to hear that this deity is giving this man who didn't own a speck of ground a promise that he would own it in 400 years or, forever. And that's a shock to the story. Then in 14, verse 16, that would be, he brought back all the goods of the goyim that, that have been armied against him or, had arisen against him. So yeah, to me, these are stories that you don't have to make it look strange to explain a Divine Council worldview, or at least the basis of it. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. Let's get into the story then. In our model or in our video version of Genesis 14:18, Abraham is moving down the central spine of Canaan, which is the hill route, the mountainous route that goes from Shechem through Shiloh, through Jerusalem, through Hebron. It's just this hill country has a main spine, north and south, that you would travel on as you travel north and south. And one of the toll booths probably set up on that road going by would have been right next to the city of Salem, modern day Jerusalem. And in my mind's eye, I see Abraham with his nephew Lot, and again, all these trained military guys coming behind on their horses and stuff and camels, whatever. And they're moving their way south on this road. They come to a toll booth, and sitting at the toll booth is the guy named Melchizedek. Now, don't be thrown by the idea of priest there and the idea of a king. Is he called king? King, right there in 18, king of Salem. In that worldview, when you say Melech or king, it could just as well be interpreted as a modern day mayor. It would be the kind of guy who would be very involved in the everyday circumstances of a village like Salem, small village. And so a king would be the kind of guy who would go around, he would probably circle the city every night, making sure it's safe, the equivalent of turning off the lights of your house before everyone goes to bed. In other words, don't think of a guy sitting on a throne. Think of a guy who is in charge of a city And, he's looking out for his own people in that city. That's what this guy's doing.
A Midwestern
He brings
mayor.
out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. I'm sorry?
I was just imagining a Midwestern mayor, right? Like a guy who's just in a small town. He's just going around, just checking up on how everyone's doing, giving folks an update about what the police found. A cat went up a tree.
Yeah, there you go. Getting the cats down. But he's sitting at the toll booth probably because of how the story's moving here. And a conversation breaks out between Abram and this guy. His name is Melchizedek. And again, that word priest, don't think too much of that yet, because a priest in the story of the Bible can be appointed. It can be someone by God, appointed by God or by men. And the idea is that he's going to be our spokesman to God for us, or whatever God you worship. And priests, again, are a pagan idea that goes well before the days of the Bible. So he was but notice how the verse ends. He was priest of el-elyon, el-elyon, God the High One, basically how you interpret that. And that's the first occurrence of that phrase. And he blessed him and said, that's the Melchizedek guy, blesses Abraham and said, blessed be Abraham of el-elyon, possessor of heaven and earth. It looks like those two guys realized they both worship the same deity. Now, that's supposed to surprise us. We have Abraham coming from Ur, all the way over to Canaan. He is in the story from up to this point, the lone worshiper of Yahweh in our story. But he meets a guy at a toll booth who is worshiping el-elyon, and they both realize apparently he's the possessor of heaven and earth. He's the High One. That's all they call him. And then verse 20, and blessed be el-elyon, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he, Abraham, gave him, Melchizedek, a tenth. That tenth could be the toll, going down the toll road. It could be a toll plus a tip. We're just not sure what that is. The point is that he gives him something that the biblical text will then, especially Hebrews, will pick this story up, I think, do a midrash on it and say, who's tipping whom? It's an interesting story, right? That Abraham tips Melchizedek and not vice versa. And that's why Jesus will be pictured as the Melchizedek character in the Hebrews 7 story. Let's not get, I'm willing to get into that if we have time, but, let's do it now. In this sense, who is Melchizedek? We don't know. He becomes a mythical, and I'm going to use that word in the traditional sense of myth. I don't mean untrue. I mean stories that have meaning outside of themselves, beyond themselves. That's a myth in traditional literary sense. Melchizedek becomes a mythical person because he's only, and this is in Jewish tradition as well as in Christian tradition, he is mentioned in only two other places then in the Bible, one in the Old, one in the New. In Psalm 110, I'm going to run to it, you have what seems to be a traditional, or what's used in tradition, a king's enthronement ceremony. So you have in Psalm 110, the most quoted Old Testament passage in the New, most alluded to, and probably hundreds of times, at least in allusion, we hear these words. Yahweh said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Yahweh shall send the rod of your strength out of Zion, rule in the midst of your enemies. And I need to drop down to verse 4. The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You, the you there seems to be the king who is being installed in the Davidic line. Again, we're moving well into the biblical story. But David was promised to always have a blood relative, a son, taking the throne of Israel if he remains loyal to Yahweh. That's a presumed forfeiture if he doesn't, and that's, again, the divided kingdom to come. But the idea of if they remain loyal to Yahweh, you can presume, David, you're going to have your blood relative always being the king. And this seems to be, from most people's understanding, what was said over that king when he was enthroned. And here are the words, you are a priest forever the king is, according to the order of Melchizedek. Again, it's kind of weird in the middle of a psalm to bring up the name of an otherwise unknown, and here's the key, pagan. Melchizedek is not a Jew. He's a pagan. And by pagan, I mean in the best sense of the term. He's a non-Jew.
He's a Gentile, as we would say it.
He is living, I'm sorry?
He's a Gentile, as how some folks would describe it.
Yeah. I would say, yeah. So I use the word pagan in the religious sense of a non-Jew. But Melchizedek is a Gentile, and yet we're swearing in the kings of Judah with this line, you are a priest like Melchizedek. Now, we wonder what in the world's going on there. Again, this is not anything to do with the Divine Council worldview as to how you take this. So I'm just going to give you my opinion, and again, jump in if you'd like, Mike. I think what the text is saying is, we met in our story, the Jewish story. A man, Abraham, met a man who was worshiping our God in a foreign land, and that man, we gave that man a tithe, a tenth. We said thank you to him or whatever. We had a relationship with him that was good, and that we came away from that. Again, the story will end in Genesis 14, and we'll never hear of a Melchizedek again. We develop a tradition then in the Jewish mind of a Gentile priest who is worshiping Yahweh. And that blows our mind. And we're supposed to have it blown in the sense that the priests of Judah, the kings of Judah, over which this enthronement ceremony is read, are never known to be priests. David wasn't a priest. Solomon wasn't a priest. None of the kings were priests that we know of. So that priestliness of the kingly line is, notice, taken from this verse, that it's like a Gentile worshiper of Yahweh. And again, we don't know what he means by this or what the text is trying to get at, as much as I think they're just celebrating. I guess this is the big point. They're celebrating the idea that our God, Yahweh, is king over the world, even though he has given us this plot of land, this king at this time, for this reign. But he, this king, whoever king this is set over, is going to have a relationship to the God who possesses heaven and earth. Do we have any example of that? Yes. We've got a guy in our tradition down in Salem, back in Genesis 14, who our forefather met, named Melchizedek. That's the best I can do with it after reading all of everything I can read on the guy and looking at Jewish tradition. Any thoughts there, Mike?
A while ago, while Dr. Heiser was alive, one question in the private community, someone asked, is there any way for us to find out which of the divine beings from Genesis 10:11 or Deuteronomy 32, were any of them loyal? Would we know what their names were? And I remember Dr. Heiser's response is, if they were loyal, we would never know their names. Right? Because if you're a loyal divine being who is doing what you're supposed to be doing, which is, I gave you this people group to take care of. You're supposed to take care of them, minister justice, make sure they're okay. Let me focus my time and attention right now on Abraham and his family and everything. If they did their job right, the nations would be knowing about the Creator God, not about them. And that was Dr. Heiser's point. And so that for those who were loyal, we would never know their names because they would never want the attention on themselves. They would actually be doing their job properly. And
yeah, I like that.
And I think that this is part of where I've always wondered, how in the world did we get a Melchizedek? And I think this is just conjecture. This is just looking at the text because we don't know anything else about him besides this reference and two other references in the actual scriptures. But somehow he knows about the Creator God. And if Genesis 10 and 11 and Deuteronomy 32 eventually comes into play, I would like to imagine that one of the few divine beings who stayed loyal to Yahweh, who was given charge of the nations.
I love this.
It's that divine being did his job, because Melchizedek actually knew who the creator God is, not the divine being that told him the information.
Now, Melchizedek even gets the tradition of being a divine being in some Jewish traditions, that they imagine that Abraham didn't even meet a man here. He met a messenger, a malachim, or a malach. And that's just tradition. We don't know. What's interesting is that Melchizedek does get a 4-page spread in the Dictionary of Demons and Deities, the Brill volume that every Divine Council Worldview advocate needs to buy or have online. It's the standard text for this kind of discussion. Melchizedek gets a spread because, again, the tradition coming out of Genesis 14 is the shock value of Abraham meeting a guy who worshipped el-elyon, which, again, we could take time on this one too. There's various places we could stop, but again, not important to just a Divine Council worldview, so I'm going to just highlight it, is this phrase el-elyon, God the High One. Over time, and by the way, he will be called el-elyon here and elsewhere. That is not just here. Psalm 9:2, Psalm 7:17, Isaiah 14:14. I would even say Luke 1:20 and Luke 1:32. If you're in the Christmas season and you're reading this, I would read it the way they would have read it, and let me do that. Luke 1:32. This is Jesus. They'll call his name Jesus. He will be great. This is Gabriel, I believe. Yes, talking to Mary. He will be great. He will be called the Son of the Highest. Again, ellipsis, Son of the Highest deity. So they're still talking in that high God language, even in the days of Mary. Well, I take it back. Even in the days of, I just reminded myself, in Acts 16. This girl, Acts 16 in Ephesus, a girl is following, or Philippi, behind Paul and Silas, and she's saying this: these men are the servants of the Most High God. Now it's in Greek here, so it's going to be the high theos, the Most High theos. So the point is that el-elyon, God the High One, in liberal thought, it's the God of Canaan who is someday transposed into Yahweh. And there's this view, again, in a history of religions kind of approach to the Bible, that Yahweh worship is a development out of Canaanite religion. I don't buy that. Neither did Dr. Heiser. I know you don't buy it either, Mike. The idea that Yahweh worship can happen completely on its own, as the story of the Bible presents it. God comes to a man in Ur. That man travels to Canaan. There happens to be a common language. It's not even Hebrew, probably, where you would call a deity an El, or if it's in Phoenician, an Il. If it's in Akkadian, an Ilu. There's just all sorts of languages that have a common sound to it when it talks about the divine world. And it just so happens that El in Hebrew can be used of Yahweh in the sense it's a title. So you'd call him el-elyon, God the High One, and everyone's fine with it. So that's a quick rendition of why you'd use that phrase and why we would expect Melchizedek to use that phrase. He doesn't know the name Yahweh, and I don't think Abraham knew it yet either. So they're worshiping the same deity. That's the key. And that's to your point, this portal idea too, and the divine possibility that Melchizedek is himself some kind of a being that is being taught by his patron deity that's in charge of that part of land. Maybe this patron deity is a loyalist to Yahweh and has taught Melchizedek about Yahweh. That'd be a wonderful thing to find out someday. Yeah. So he is, by the way, he's brought up in Hebrews 7. Melchizedek is as a priest of Gentile descent. I think the reason that Jesus is compared to Melchizedek there is because if you're a Gentile, you're wanting to have a priesthood to somehow connect you to the Jewish faith. Mm-hmm. If you're a Gentile, again, you're outside the family. You need rituals. You need something to replace or even to stand in for all those rituals that a Jew has that you don't. And I think the reason that Melchizedek is brought into the story is an encouragement to the Gentile audience that we have in our story as Jews a Gentile priest. And guess what? Jesus is not from the land or not from the lineage of Judah or Levi, and yet he is our priest. How can Jesus be a priest? Well, we had a Gentile one, so we can certainly have a non-Levitical one. And I think that's just the connection that's being made there.
I think. Can I mention something else, Ron?
Anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
Because I know some folks will be upset if we don't mention this at all. But like Psalm 82 is also another instance where el-elyon appears.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's go there. I didn't look up every instance, but that would be a good one.
It's Psalm 82. Verse
Psalm
6.
82. Yeah. In el-elyon, is that? Yeah, there it is in 6, 82:6. I said, you are Elohim, all of you are children of el-elyon.
All of
There we go.
Yeah. So like it is a title that it does appear several times, and especially in a very important passage like Psalm 82 is. The other thought though I did have about the Hebrews 7 is that. Right, it's like in some sense, Hebrews is also going with this overall messaging theme of Jesus is better. Jesus is better, and Jesus is better than the angels. Jesus is better than this and that. And when you get to Hebrews 7, it seems to be saying that we have a priesthood because Jesus is in the line of this priesthood, Melchizedek's, and it's even better than Aaron's. It's better than what we're used to. And so in some sense, and I always wondered this about Abraham himself, because he grew up from a good part of his life, very pagan, right? Like he came from a city that worshiped other Elohim, other gods. And the way that he acts and the way that he behaves oftentimes is very reminiscent of, just a regular human being, a regular, Gentile pagan worshiper. And he's learning over the years how different el-elyon, or the God that he's following, is compared to all the other deities. And so I do find it more also comforting that in some sense, there is a priesthood that's not just for us Gentiles, but really actually for all peoples, that is greater than what was introduced later eventually through Exodus and Leviticus. That this is even a greater one that has a more prestige line, right? If we're going with like an idea of like
good point.
Heritage lines or like breeds of dogs or something like that, people make a big deal about the heritage lines. Melchizedek's is like the premier one,
right? And thank you. And to the story, it's fascinating that again he comes out of nowhere, and that we can have this line, if we want to call it a priesthood, out of this line that, as Hebrews will say, he has no father, no mother, no beginning, no ending. What they're doing there is just taking the story as it appears. Is we don't have a lineage for this guy. He just shows up, and yet we can connect to him. So to me, it's a midrash. Again, it's a use of the text in a very respectful way, leaving the text meaning what it means, not changing the meaning of the text, but lifting out the idea and applying it to an audience generations later. We do it every Sunday in church, I find. Our pastors midrash the Bible. They'll pick out a story and moralize it sometimes. And I'm just saying that it's so easy to do that, you pick up a story and you use it for your audience. If it's not in exactly the same meaning of the original reader and writer, that's usually what we'd call a midrash in Jewish thinking. So it's a very respectful way to handle the story, a very necessary one, but just be ready in Jewish tradition for the name Melchizedek to be held strong and high, even though he is clearly a king of Salem. He is not even a Jew at this point. Well, of course, very few Jews at this point. We only have Abraham himself. But fascinating moment when these men meet. I was going to say something, and wouldn't you know, I forget what it is. Oh, well, yeah, I'll let it go. I might come back by the time we're done. We are getting close. 21 to 24 is just a kind of going back to the king of Sodom when he finally talks to the king of Sodom. Now, the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons and take the goods for yourself." Abram said, and he's just trying to be, again, showing, if you want to moralize this, a very giving, self-effacing individual. I have lifted my hand to Yahweh, God Most High, el-elyon, the possessor of heaven and earth, and I will take nothing from a thread to a sandal strap, that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. So Abram, again, he seems to be a very humble, kind, giving man, and that little short story seems to is there to show that. But here's where, again, we can summarize our podcast this way then, looking through 14. If you are reading the story as a first-timer sitting at your father's knee and hearing the story of Genesis 14, I can't help but think what you're catching is which God. It's a which God story. And whether it's Abram defeating these kings, verses 8 and 9 are two sets of 9 kings in all. So it's a big group. And I'm coming in behind the story as an Abram figure, and I'm winning, right? I really think that's what you're going to remember. And then that my father figure Abraham, the one who was called by the great God, the possessor of heaven and earth, the real capital G God in our English terms, right? He's coming down a toll road and he happens to meet a man who also worships the same deity. That is a stunner of a moment that you would not have expected. The way this story is moving, right? A man having moved from Ur of the Chaldees to this otherwise pagan territory comes upon a man who is similar of worship, I think, is again the purpose of our story, and how we can develop that then into other questions like you brought up, Mike. If this God that or this messenger that was in charge of this area, again, thinking in terms of divine counsel, if he was a loyalist, would this be the result? I think this would be the kind of story that could fit into that. So I may have brought it up before, but my family, 2 generations back, married into, my dad's side married into a man's grandparents married each other on our story, and one of them was a missionary to China. So I grew up as a young boy hearing stories of this man that married my grandmother before I was born, and he has stories of meeting Adoniram Judson and going through China. Did I ever tell you this story, Mike? I forget.
I don't think so.
And and he tells stories. Again, I'm just a little kid sitting at his knee, but he would tell stories of going around the corner of a village or into a new village that, as far as he understood and the way the villagers talked, they had never seen a white man. Okay, first time, right? This is back in the early 1900s. And yet they worshiped Yahweh. He's like, I remember a couple of years he would say, what? How did you come to worship the God I worship? Now, it was Jesus. I should have said Jesus, because it was. And so he was going to evangelize Jesus to this, little village in China, and here they already worshiped him.
Which is amazing.
And he told this story of, one village that he met, he tells a story of they claimed that a plane had crashed in the, nearby area, and they found in the plane Bibles. And the village converted from the worship of their ancestral deities or whatever to the worship of Jesus. And so, again, is that free will, or is that divine providence? Is that I'm tipping my hand here? Is that the way God can sometimes get a Melchizedek figure to show up in a story by bringing the gospel that way, So to me, growing up as a boy, hearing these stories from my grandpa, whom I loved, he was just a delightful man, old man by the time I knew him. But boy, he had stories, and I wanted to worship the God he talked about, and I still do. So that's my Melchizedek story.
As you're sharing this, it warms my heart personally, because because I'm ethnically Chinese. I was born and bred and proud Bostonian through and through, and yet, for a long time, after I became a Christian, there was always this nagging thought of, why did it take 19 and a half centuries for the gospel to get into China, right? And eventually, now in school and in my last year in school, I'm taking this course on Eastern Christianity and discovering the very real possibility that the gospel entered my homeland, of my ethnic homeland, as possibly as early as the fifth century. And even some scholars would contend maybe into the first to the second century. And just that thought itself of just seeing how even Christian names started appearing in Western China, villages started hearing or talking about this God of light or of illumination, and it was just a very comforting realization that yes, again, our God Jesus actually cares about the nations, and that He will find a way to get the message, the proclamation of who He is to people groups in the most weirdest ways, and maybe in ways we'll never learn about until the other side of heaven.
Yeah.
But man, that was moving for me to realize you did care about my people, even so many more centuries before even as Western Christians, we assume Christianity got into the region of China, into the region of Japan and other places. It's just we don't hear about it. You know, maybe many of them were lost to time, but it was comforting to even realize, even as early as the 5th century, that we have at least records of that the gospel made it there.
And it might be our fault too, as you're hinting that in Western culture because we've divided our towns into four churches on a corner with empty parking lots every Sunday. I mean, in other words, in America, we've had the land and the money to divide. And we have now, I remember in Rockford, Illinois, a friend of mine who was from there said there's 42 different Baptist churches in Rockford. So when you say I'm Baptist, the first question is what kind? Or Lutheran, what kind, right? I mean, it's so sad that we've gone that far. But my bigger point is that we've learned to divide so fast, whereas in like a China, I'm sure that village that my grandpa came upon, they couldn't imagine dividing over things or even theological views, I'm sure, because they worship the same deity. That's what made them them. And I would say that's a good lesson to learn. I grew up thinking everyone who wasn't in my church was not a Christian. That's just how a young boy thinks, right? And then you find out later, now that I'm going back to my high school reunions, 40th, I had my 40th high school reunion last summer. Boy, there's some good Christian people that I had no idea were living in the same town and high school I was in. But I didn't know because I was thinking I'm right, they're wrong. And here it turns out they were worshiping the same God I was, even though it was under a different label. So, well, we got to close it up. I want to predict what I'm going to ask you at the start of the next podcast, as we'll be doing this, I think, from now on. I'm just going to throw out a question to start our time. And next time it'll be, why do you think Matthew Bates' book called Allegiance, or Gospel by Allegiance, what's the
Gospel Allegiance, or
what's the
Salvation by Allegiance Alone?
Saved by Allegiance, or what's the name of the title?
I think Salvation by Allegiance Alone is the first word.
Salvation by Allegiance Alone. There we go. Why do you think evangelicalism struggles with that title, even? Not just the concept, but even the title. I'm just fascinated by that. So let's save that question for the beginning of next time, because next time Genesis 15 is, of course, the great paradigm-causing verse 6. He said, or 15:6, he believed in the Lord and he accounted it to him for righteousness. So we'll spend a good amount of time on that verse, and salvation by allegiance alone will be a good way to begin that conversation. So anything else before we sign off? We're good to go.
Oh, I was thinking I might bring it up in the next time we meet, but I do have a little bit of a smirk on my face whenever I read that last part in 14 with Abram meeting the king of Sodom. And it's very interesting. It's very telling to me that the king of Sodom wanted Abram's men, like those 318 guys.
Oh.
You keep the money, you keep the possessions, all the clothing, the gold. I want those guys. And that it's almost as though it's like he's saying, like, wow, your men fight way better than mine. I want these guys. But Abram,
yeah, good point.
so tactfully, right, in not wanting to insult this king, but it says like, no, you keep the possessions because I serve, el-elyon. I serve the God Most High. I trust in Him, basically, and I don't want you to ever claim that you made me rich. I'll keep my men though, and just the stuff that we had to eat in order to bring all this stuff back to you. But you take back all the stuff. I want to keep my guys, and it's just,
I like it.
I find it funny because in some sense, like that was the whole reason why Abram went out there in the first place, was to rescue one guy, and Lot's family. And so like, no, I'm not going to give you my people. but he had to say it in a very polite, very respectful way, so that it doesn't shame.
I like your point though, that there's probably hidden humor in here too, a little bit for the reader. And the grandpa, I always think of a grandpa reading this to his child, at night going to bed and his eyes sparkling like that, and the kid picking it up. So very good. Well, thank you, Mike. Always a joy, and we'll talk to everyone next time.
All right.